Nerys had knelt on the cold marble of the great hall for the length of 100 heartbeats, and in every single one of them, she had been certain she was about to die. The Hall of Iron Moon was built to make people feel small. Pause. She understood that now. The ceiling vanished into shadow far above her, held up by columns of black stone veined with silver, and every surface threw the torchlight back at strange angles, so the whole room seemed to shift and breathe. 2 rows of the king's guard lined the aisle behind her, close enough that she could hear the leather of their gloves creak when they moved. She kept her eyes on the floor. She had been told, very clearly, on the long road here, that a girl like her did not look at the king unless the king told her to. A girl like her. A payment with legs. That was what the collector had called her when he'd pried her fingers off the doorframe of the only home she'd ever known. She could feel the pendant against her breastbone, warm as it always was, a small, stubborn heat under her thin shift. She had worn it every day of her life. It was the one thing that was truly hers. The one thing the collectors hadn't been able to price, because when the man had reached for it, her father had said, in a voice she'd never heard him use, "That stays with her, or you take nothing at all." And for reasons she still didn't understand, they had let her keep it. At the far end of the hall, on a dais of the same black stone, the Alpha King of Iron Moon sat and looked at nothing. She had stolen exactly one glance at him when they brought her in, and the glance had been enough. Soren Vael did not look like a story. Stories made kings golden. This one was carved out of something colder, broad through the shoulders, in a way that suggested he could put a man through a wall without rising from his chair. Dark-haired, with a stillness to him that was worse than any shouting. This was the man who had ended the Northern War, not by winning battles, but by making the idea of fighting him unbearable. The man whose name mothers used to make children behave. And she was going to be handed to his household like a sack of grain against a sum her father could never repay. Kitchens, she told herself, staring at the seam between 2 marble tiles. Please, just let it be the kitchens. Or the laundries, somewhere with a door and a bucket, and nobody who cares what my name is. She had spent the whole journey building a smaller and smaller life for herself in her head, because a small life was survivable, and she had gotten very good at surviving. The steward's voice rang out, bored and enormous. The debt of Edmund Thorne of the River District unpaid across 3 seasons, payment rendered in kind, as is the crown's right, 1 daughter, sound of body, a pause. Where shall she be sent, my king? This was the moment. This was where a bored word would decide the rest of her life, and Nerys braced for it the way she'd learned to brace for everything. Quietly, completely, without letting it show on her face. The king did not answer. The silence stretched a beat too long, then another. Nerys risked lifting her eyes, just enough to see, and found the king no longer looking at nothing. He was looking at her. No, not at her. At her throat. At the small silver moon resting in the hollow of her collarbone, and the most dangerous man alive had gone the color of ash. He rose. It was not a graceful movement, it was the movement of a man who has forgotten he has a body and is using it anyway. The scrape of his chair was the loudest sound the hall had ever held. Down the length of the room she heard the shift and rustle of 40 courtiers realizing at the same instant that something was happening that had never happened before, and none of them knew the shape of it. He came down off the dais. She heard someone gasp, a lady near the front. A small broken sound quickly swallowed. Kings did not descend. Kings did not walk toward a bonded debtor, kneeling in the aisle with the guards' shadows falling over her. But he was walking, each step slow and deliberate and terrible, his gray eyes fixed on the pendant like it was the only real thing in a room full of ghosts. Move, some animal part of her screamed. Run. She didn't move. There was nowhere in the world to run to. She was a payment. Payments held still. He stopped an arm's length away. Up close he was even larger, and the cold had gone out of his face, and left something rawer underneath, something she had absolutely no name for. He smelled of iron and cold air and faintly of grief. Though how a scent could be grief she couldn't have said. When he crouched down to her level, unhurried, the entire hall stopped breathing with her. His gaze moved from the pendant to her face and back. She saw his throat work. "Where?" the king said, and his voice was very quiet and very careful, the way a man is careful, lifting something he is terrified to break. Her mouth was dry. It's mine, sire," she whispered. "I've always had it. I swear I didn't steal." "That's not what I asked." He wasn't angry. That was the strange part. She had expected fury, and instead his hand rose toward the pendant and stopped, hovering, as though he didn't trust himself to touch it. "Who gave it to you?" "No one gave it to me. I've had it since before. I can remember. My father said I came with it." Something crossed his face then, so fast she almost missed it, and the something looked like a wound reopening. The pendant against her skin, which had been warm her whole life, went suddenly, searingly hot, hot enough that she flinched, her hand flying up to it, and in the same instant, so did his eyes. He had felt it too. She didn't know how. She knew that. She simply knew. For a long moment, the Alpha King of Iron Moon knelt on the floor of his own throne room across from a girl who had been given away like a debt, and stared at her as though the ground had opened between them. Then he spoke again, softer than before. So soft, she was sure no one else, in that enormous hall, could hear it. And what he said made no sense at all, and it made the hair rise on the back of her neck, and she would remember it for the rest of her life. "You're supposed to be dead." 3 days earlier, Neris Thorne had still believed the worst thing that could happen to her was another winter. She woke before dawn, the way she always did in the narrow loft above her father's failing dye house in the river district. The city of Ironmoon spread below the shutters in its usual gray hush, smoke and river fog and the smell of wet wool, and she lay for a moment listening to her father cough. Downstairs, the deep, wet cough that had been getting worse all season. They couldn't afford most things anymore. That was the shape of Neris's life, and had been for as long as she could remember. The careful arithmetic of not quite enough. Enough flour if they went without oil. Enough coal if they wore 2 shifts to bed. Her father had been a good dyer once, before his hands began to shake, and their little house had smelled of indigo and madder, and the strange bitter herbs he used to fix the colors fast. Now the vats sat mostly cold, and the good customers had gone to the guild shops uptown, and the money that came in went straight back out again to a name Neris had learned to dread. Lord Varick. The crown's creditor for the whole river district, the man who bought up other men's debts, the way some men collected coins, and who had, 3 winters ago, bought her father's. She dressed in the dark and went down and put the kettle on, and her father came in from the yard, with his knuckles blue from the cold, and gave her the smile he always gave her, the one that pretended everything was fine. "You're up early, little moon," he said. It was what he'd always called her since she was small, little moon, and she'd never questioned it, any more than she questioned the pendant. The silver disc he said she'd worn even as an infant, the one thing from a past neither of them could explain. He'd found her, he told her once, and only once, when she was too young to remember, a bundle left at the dye house door on the coldest night of a bad year, with a moon around her neck and no note at all. He had meant, he said, to hand her to the temple. He never had. "I couldn't," was all he'd say when she asked why. "You looked at me." She loved him with a fierceness that frightened her sometimes, this tired man who was not her blood and had never once made her feel it. Which was why, when the knock came at the door that morning, 3 hard raps, the kind that don't wait, she felt her stomach drop before she'd even crossed the room. Varick's collectors did not knock like men who expected to be turned away. There were 2 of them in the gray and silver livery that the whole district had learned to fear, and behind them a clerk with a ledger, and the clerk read out the number of what her father owed in a flat little voice, and the number was so large, it stopped meaning anything. Her father's face did something Nerys had never seen it do. It crumpled. "I need more time," he said. "The spring orders." "There's no more time to give," the clerk said, not unkindly, which was somehow worse. "But the Crown permits payment in kind. There's a provision, bond service, against the sum, until it's discharged." His eyes moved past her father to the doorway, where Nerys stood with the kettle still in her hand, and they moved over her the way a man's eyes move over livestock at market. Sound of body counts double. Everything after that happened very fast and very slow at the same time. She remembered her father putting himself between her and the door, a sick man of 50 against 2 armed collectors, and the collector simply setting a hand on his chest and pushing, and her father going down hard against the cold dye vat, a sound she would hear in her nightmares. She remembered screaming, an arm hauling her back, her own hands scrabbling at the doorframe, until her nails tore. And she remembered the moment the second collector reached for the pendant at her throat. "That'll fetch something," he said. And her father, on the floor, shaken and gray-faced, dragging himself up onto one elbow and saying in a voice that came from somewhere she'd never known he had, "That stays with her, or you take nothing at all. Nothing. You'll have to kill me first, and then you'll have to explain to your lord why the payment's dead in the doorway." The collector had laughed. But he'd let go of the pendant. And Nerys never understood, in all the days that followed, why a threat from a broken man on the floor had been enough. Only that something in her father's face, when he said it had made even those 2 hard men decide it wasn't worth the trouble. They gave her a quarter of an hour to gather her things. She spent most of it kneeling by her father, pressing a cloth to his head, both of them saying the useless, brave things people say when there's nothing to be done. "I'll find a way to pay it down. I'll come home. It won't be long." Neither of them believed it. Bond service against a debt like theirs wasn't a season's work, it was the rest of a life. "Little Moon," her father said at the very end, gripping her hand, his eyes wet and terrified, in a way that had nothing to do with the blood. "Listen to me. Whatever happens up there, wherever they send you, you keep that around your neck, you hear me? You don't take it off. Not for anyone. It's just a necklace, Papa," she said, trying to make him smile. He held her hand so hard it hurt. "It's not," he said. "I don't know what it is, but it's not." Then the collectors came back, and they took her. The journey to the upper city took 2 days on the back of a supply cart, and Nerys spent it learning the small, brutal facts of what she'd become. That she was to be delivered to the royal household as payment, not to Varric's own house. Some clause of the Crown's provision she didn't understand, that made bonded debts serve the palace directly. That she was not to speak unless spoken to. That she was, in the words of the guard who'd taken charge of her at the gate, "the king's problem now, God's help you." She hadn't understood that last part. She'd assumed it was cruelty. She lay awake both nights of the journey, with her hand closed around the warm silver at her throat, and she thought about her father's face, and she made herself a promise, the way she made all her promises, small and quiet and complete. "I will survive this, whatever it is. I will keep my head down, and I will survive it, and I will find my way back to him." She was still telling herself that on the morning they walked her through the black stone corridors of the Palace of Ironmoon, past tapestries older than her whole district, toward a set of doors taller than her father's house. She was still telling herself that when the steward's hand closed on her shoulder and steered her through the doors and pushed her, none too gently, down onto her knees on the cold marble of the great hall. And that was how Nerys Thorne, who wanted nothing in the world but a quiet corner and a way home, came to kneel before the most dangerous man alive, with no idea that the small silver moon at her throat was about to bring his entire kingdom down around them both. For a long moment after the king said the words that made no sense, nothing in the great hall moved at all. "You're supposed to be dead." Nerys's mind refused them. She was not dead. She was extremely, terrifyingly alive, kneeling on a floor, cold enough to ache, with the whole court of Ironmoon staring at the back of her neck, and the largest man she had ever seen, crouched close enough that she could see the faint tremor in his hands. "He's mad!" she thought wildly. The rumors were wrong. He isn't cruel. He's mad. The war broke his mind, and now I'm going to be executed by a lunatic over a piece of jewelry. "Sire," she whispered, because someone had to say something, and no one else seemed able to. I don't understand." The sound of her voice seemed to reach him from a long way off. He blinked. And she watched, fascinated and horrified, as the king put himself back together in the space of a single breath, the rawness folding away behind his eyes, the color returning to his face, the terrible stillness dropping back over him like a visor. By the time he rose to his full height, he was a king again, and the man who had knelt on the floor and looked at her like a ghost might never have existed at all. "Clear the hall," he said. He did not raise his voice. He didn't have to. The court of Ironmoon emptied like water from a cracked cup, courtiers gathering their skirts and their whispers, and flowing toward the doors, throwing back glances she would come to know very well in the days ahead. Who is she? What did she do? Why did the king come down off the dais? Within a minute, the enormous room held only Nerys, the king, 2 guards at the doors, and one other man she hadn't noticed before. Lean, sharp-faced, standing at the king's shoulder, with the stillness of someone who missed nothing. "Tallis," the king said to him, low. "No one hears of this. The steward, the guards on the aisle. No one. It's already handled," the lean man said. His eyes were on Nerys, and they were not unkind, but they were doing arithmetic, and she was the sum. "Sire, are you certain it's—" "I'm certain." The king's voice didn't leave room for the question to finish. Then to Nerys, in that careful, controlled tone that frightened her more than shouting would have, "Stand up." She stood. Her legs had gone to sleep and nearly betrayed her, and his hand twitched at his side as if to catch her before he caught himself and let it fall. "The debt is settled," he said. "Thorn, your father's debt to the crown. It's discharged. As of this moment, there is no sum. Do you understand?" She did not understand. She understood the words the way you understand words in a dream, each one clear and the sentence they made impossible. "Discharged," she repeated. All of it? All of it. Why?" It came out before she could stop it. Too loud in the empty hall, and she saw the lean man, Tallis, wince. But the king only looked at her, and something moved behind his eyes that she couldn't read. "Because you are not a payment," he said. "You never were. There has been a mistake." He turned away before she could ask what mistake, before she could point out that a discharged debt did not unbreak her father's head, or untake her from her home, and said to Tallis, "Have you Zold brought to the North Tower rooms?" And put her, a slight, deliberate pause, as though he'd realized he didn't have a word for what she now was. "Put her somewhere safe. Guard the door, not to keep her in, to keep everyone else out safe." Nerys thought, from what? The North Tower rooms were nothing like the servants' quarters she'd braced for, small but warm, a real bed, a window over the frost-silvered roofs of the lower city, a fire already burning as though someone had known she was coming. She stood clutching her small bundle of belongings, and felt more lost than she had in the throne room, because there, at least, she'd understood her place. Here she understood nothing. The old woman came within the hour. She was small and stooped and dressed in the plain gray of a palace servant, but the guards stepped aside for her, the way they'd step aside for a lord, and when she came through the door she stopped, and looked at Nerys, and went very still. "Well," said Risold softly, after a moment, "there's a face I never thought to see again. You know me." Nerys's heart was hammering. "Everyone here keeps," the king said. "I'm supposed to be dead. The way you're looking at me. Please. I don't understand any of this. Who do you all think I am?" Isolde didn't answer at once. She crossed the room with the careful gait of the very old, took Nerys's chin in one dry hand, and turned her face toward the firelight. studying it the way a scholar studies a text. Then her gaze dropped to the pendant, and her breath caught, and her thumb came up to hover over it, exactly the way the king's had, close, but not touching, as if touching it were a thing you had to earn. "May I?" she asked. Nerys, not knowing what else to do, nodded. The old woman lifted the silver moon on the ball of her thumb, tilted it to the light, and read something on its back that Nerys had felt 1,000 times with her own fingertips and never been able to make sense of. A fine line of markings, worn almost smooth, that her father had once said looked like the tracks of a very small bird. Weisold let the pendant fall. When she looked up, her old eyes were wet. "Sit down, child," she said. "Sit down, and I'll tell you what I can, though I warn you now, you're going to wish I hadn't." She lowered herself into the chair by the fire and folded her hands, and for a moment the only sound in the room was the flames. "What do you know?" she said at last. "About the moon veil." The word did something strange in Nerys's chest. She didn't know why. "Nothing," she said. "It's a place, a pack, a pack. Once. Weisolde's voice was very quiet. "A small one. Old. The way roots are old. They kept to the high valleys in the north, and troubled no one, and they carried the oldest blood of all of us. The blood that remembers what our kind was, before we had kings and debts and stone halls to make each other feel small." Her mouth thinned. 20 years ago they were lost in a single night. Every soul, every family, every child. It was called a casualty of the Northern War. It was the beginning of everything that made our king what he is. She looked at the pendant again, and then at Nerys's face, and something in her seemed to break and mend at the same time. "That moon at your throat is the token of the moon veil line. There were only ever a handful of them made, and only one that carried the marks yours does. The heir's moon. It was lost the night the pack died. Burned, we all believed, with everyone who ever knew what it meant. The fire popped." Nerys realized she'd stopped breathing. "So you see," Weisolde said gently, "why the king came down off his throne, and why he said what he said. Because the last person known to have worn that pendant was a Moonveil child, who vanished the night the valleys burned." She reached out and closed her dry old hand over Nerys's cold one. "A child, everyone in this palace, the king most of all, has spent 20 years believing they let die." Nerys's mouth opened, no sound came out. And before she could find any, a knock sounded at the door, sharp, urgent, and Tallis stepped in without waiting, his sharp face tight with something that hadn't been there an hour before. "Yisold," he said, "forgive me. But the king needs the girl." He looked at Nerys, and for the first time, the arithmetic in his eyes had turned to something that looked almost like fear. Tonight, in his private chambers, a muscle worked in his jaw. "He hasn't slept in 11 days. And whatever that pendant is, an hour ago, when he was near it, in the hall," he stopped, as though he couldn't quite believe he was going to say it. "For the first time since the war, I saw him close his eyes." Nerys did not want to go to the king's private chambers. She said as much to Isolde, who only patted her hand and told her the king was many dangerous things, but not, she thought, dangerous to her. She said it to the guard who came at dusk, who said nothing at all. And she said it, most emphatically, inside her own head. The entire length of the long climb to a part of the castle, where the tapestries were finer and the very air felt like it belonged to someone she had no right to be near. "This is a mistake," she thought. "For what felt like the 100th time, an hour ago I was a debt. Now I'm the ghost of a dead heir being marched to a war king's bedroom in the dark. Nothing about this can end well." Her mind unhelpfully supplied several vivid theories about why a man might summon a young woman to his chambers after nightfall. And she felt her face go hot in the cold corridor. No, absolutely not. Weisold said he isn't, he wouldn't, but she didn't actually know that, did she? She was a girl who had woken up 3 days ago worried about winter, and now she was here. The guard stopped at a set of iron-banded doors and knocked once. Enter. The king's chambers were the size of her whole street. Weapons hung on the walls, swords, a great notched war axe, a shield bearing a crest she didn't recognize, and a fire roared in a hearth she could have stood upright in. And dominating the far end of the room, impossible to look at, and impossible not to, was the bed. It was enormous. Nerys took one look at it and fixed her eyes very deliberately on the floor. The king stood by the window with his back to her, and he did not turn around when she came in, and for a moment she thought he might have forgotten he'd summoned her at all. "Your Majesty," she said, when she couldn't bear the silence. You don't have to be afraid of me." He said it to the window. "I know that's difficult to believe, given the day you've had." A pause. "Given the day I've given you." She didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing, which had always been her best skill. He turned then. In the firelight, the terrible stillness had softened into plain exhaustion, and she saw for the first time how bad it was. The bruised hollows under his eyes, the gray cast to his skin, the fine tremor she'd taken for fear in the hall and now understood was something else entirely. This was a man being ground down to nothing from the inside. "They'll have told you I don't sleep," he said. "Talus, you'll. They tell everyone eventually. It's not the sort of thing you can hide forever, though the gods know we've tried." His mouth twisted. Not quite a smile. 11 days this time, before that 9. I close my eyes. And something. He stopped, started again. "It doesn't matter. What matters is that this afternoon in the hall, for the space of a few seconds, while I was near you, and that," his eyes went to the pendant and away, as if it cost him. "Near that, it stopped. The thing that keeps me awake." It went quiet, for the first time in 20 years. Nerys's hand rose to the moon at her throat. "You think it's this?" "I don't know what I think." He dragged a hand down his face. "Wise-old has a theory. Something in the old blood, the Moonvale blood, a quieting. She'd explain it better. I stopped being able to follow her hours ago." He gestured. A short, frustrated motion. At the room, the bed, the whole absurd situation. "I am not in the habit of asking anyone for anything, least of all a girl I wronged this morning. But I'm asking now, because I've run out of everything else to try, and Talus believes that if I don't sleep soon, I won't survive the month." He met her eyes and there was no command in it which surprised her more than a command would have. "Sit with me while I try to sleep. That's all. You have my word, that's all. Sit in that chair by the fire, and stay, and let's see if it's real." She should have said no. She had every reason to say no. Instead, she found herself looking at the hollows under his eyes and thinking, absurdly, of her father coughing in the dark, and of how much she would have given for something, anything, to have made him well. She knew that look. She'd worn it herself, watching someone she couldn't save. "If it's just sitting," she said slowly, "then all right, but I'm keeping my shoes on. And if you try anything at all, I'm screaming loud enough to bring the whole North Tower down, king or no king." Something flickered across his face. Surprise. And under it, so faint she almost missed it, the ghost of something that might once have been humor, a long time ago, before it had all been burned out of him. "Understood," he said gravely. So she sat in the chair by the fire, and he lay down on top of the covers of that enormous bed, fully clothed, boots and all, and stared at the ceiling like a man bracing for a blow. And Nerys folded her hands in her lap, and watched the flames and tried not to think about how strange her life had become, and the minutes stretched out long and quiet between them. She had expected nothing to happen. She had expected to sit there all night while the king lay awake and rigid, and to be sent back to the tower at dawn, having proved that a piece of old silver was just a piece of old silver. But the king's breathing changed. It was subtle at first, a slight deepening, a loosening in the rhythm. She turned her head carefully and looked at the bed. The rigid line of his shoulders had eased. The fist at his side had opened. And as she watched, unable to look away, The most dangerous man alive let out a long, shaking breath, and the hard, careful mask of his face went slack, and slid, and became simply the face of a very tired man, and slept. That was all it had taken. Nerys sat frozen in the chair, her heart pounding, torn between wonder and a fear she couldn't name, watching the rise and fall of his chest in the firelight. It's real, she thought. Isolde was right. It's the pendant. It's me. And on the heels of that came a colder thought, one that made her fingers tighten in her lap. If a piece of me can put the king to sleep, what does that make me to the people who wanted the Moonveil dead? And are they still out there? She was still turning that over, still watching him sleep, when the pendant against her breastbone, warm her whole life, searing hot for one instant in the hall that afternoon, went, all at once, ice cold. So cold it burned. So cold. She gasped and clutched at it, and the room tilted, and the fire, and the bed and the black stone walls smeared sideways into gray, and when Nerys blinked, she was no longer in the king's chambers at all. She was standing in a fog. It was thick and colorless and utterly silent, pressing in from every side. And it smelled of ash and cold stone and something worse underneath, something like grief. Skeletal trees rose out of it, too tall, their branches reaching like fingers against a dead white sky. There was no wind, no sound, nothing at all, except, somewhere out in the fog, something that moved, something patient, something that had been waiting a very long time, and had just now, she was terribly certain, noticed that she was there. And 10 paces away, with his back to her, staring into the fog at a thing she could not yet see, stood the king. "Your Majesty," her voice vanished, swallowed by the fog before it crossed half the distance between them. No echo, no sound at all, as though the place ate noise the way the cold ate warmth. The king didn't turn, didn't move. He simply stood rigid, staring into the gray at something past the skeletal trees, his hands clenched bloodless at his sides. "Your Majesty," she said again, louder, and took a step toward him. Out in the fog, something answered her. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, unhurried. The sound of a thing that did not need to rush because it knew nothing here could get away from it. With every step the cold deepened, and the pendant against her breastbone was a disk of pure ice. The king still didn't move. Whatever he was seeing all of it, and none of her. He can't hear me, she realized, animal fear washing through her. He's somewhere I can't reach, but I can reach him. She closed the distance at a stumbling run, the wrong soft ground dragging at her feet, the footsteps quickening behind her, and did the only thing she could think of. She grabbed his hand. The world came apart. Nerys blinked, and the fog was gone. She was standing beside the king's bed, the fire burning low and gold, her hand wrapped around his, and he was asleep, deeply, peacefully asleep, his face slack and unguarded, as though the gray place had never existed at all. She stood there a long time, her heart slamming, her breath ragged, staring down at him, and then down at their joined hands. The pendant had gone warm again. When she finally carefully pried her fingers loose, he made a small sound and turned his head toward the empty space where her hand had been, and did not wake. Nerys sank into the chair and did not sleep for the rest of the night. He slept until well past dawn, she knew, because she'd been awake for all of it, rattled, turning the fog over and over, trying to convince herself it had been a dream born of exhaustion. But dreams did not leave frostburn on your skin, and in the gray morning light there was a pale mark on her breastbone where the cold had bitten her. When the king woke, it was the way a man wakes after a long illness, slowly, disbelievingly, one hand rising to his own face, as if to check it was still there. Then he sat up fast, his eyes found the window and the height of the light in it, and something happened to his expression that she had no word for. "What hour is it?" he said. It wasn't quite a question. "Past the 8th bell, I think." "Your Majesty?" She hesitated. "You slept." "I slept." He said it the way another man might say I flew. He dragged both hands down his face, and when he lowered them, his eyes were bright and raw, and fixed on her with an intensity that would have frightened her yesterday, and only unsettled her now. All night. I don't. He stopped. How long have you been awake? All night, she admitted. Something in him gentled. You didn't have to do that. I couldn't exactly sleep, she pressed on before her nerve could fail her, because she had to know, Your Majesty. When you were asleep, I saw a place. Fog and dead trees, and a cold that burned, and something walking in it that I couldn't see. She watched his face. And you were there, standing in it. You couldn't hear me. Do you, her voice cracked, do you know that place? For one heartbeat, the raw, open thing was still in his face, then it slammed shut. She actually saw it happen. The shutters coming down, the king rebuilding himself stone by stone, until the man looking back at her was the one from the throne room, controlled and cold and unreachable. You imagined it, he said. You were exhausted. It's nothing. It left a mark on me. It's nothing, Nerys. He was already off the bed, already reaching for the composure he wore like armor. You have my thanks. You'll be given rooms, and whatever you need, and we'll continue this arrangement, and you will not speak to anyone of what you think you saw. That's the end of it. But it wasn't the end of it, and they both knew it. And the knowing sat between them like a third person in the room. Isolde found her an hour later, pacing the North Tower like a caged thing. He says it's nothing, Nerys told her, and heard how young and furious she sounded and didn't care. He says I imagined it, but you know what it is, don't you? You've known this whole time. The fog, the cold place, the thing walking in it. The old woman was quiet for a long moment. Then she crossed to the door and shut it, and turned, and Nerys felt her stomach drop, because she was learning that in this palace a closed door was never the beginning of good news. Sit, Isolde said, and I'll tell you the rest. Though you'll like it even less than the first part. Nerys sat. There has always been a place beneath the sleeping mind, Isolde said. The old ones called it the hollow. A between place where grief goes when it has nowhere else to live. Most of us never so much as glimpse it, but the Moonvale blood was never like most of us. It could walk there, awake and aware, the way you and I walk a corridor. Her old eyes were steady on Nerys's face. You walked it last night, child. You've been walking into it your whole life, most likely, and calling it bad dreams. It's in your blood. It's in that moon at your throat. Nerys's mouth was dry. And the king? The king is trapped in it. Isolde's voice dropped. 20 years ago, on the night the Moonvale Valleys burned, our king was there. He'll tell you nothing of it, but I've pieced enough together over the years. Whatever he saw that night, whatever he did or failed to do, it followed him home and into his sleep, and it has never once let him go. Every time he closes his eyes, the hollow takes him back to that night and makes him live it again. That is why he stopped sleeping. Not because he cannot, because he cannot bear. 2. The fire popped. Nerys thought of the rigid line of his shoulders in the fog, of a man forced to watch something over and over with no way to look away, and something in her chest twisted so hard it hurt. But I can reach him there, she said slowly. I pulled him out. Yes. Isolde leaned forward. And that is the miracle, and it is also the danger. And here is the part you will wish I hadn't told you. She reached out and took both of Nerys's cold hands in her dry ones. There is a blood moon coming, 19 nights from now. When the moon runs red, the wall between the waking world and the hollow thins to nothing, and everything on the other side grows strong. Whatever has held the king in that place for 20 years, on that night, it will be strong enough to keep him, to pull him under and not give him back. Tallis has feared it for months. It's why he was willing to try anything. Then we'll keep him out of it, Nerys said. I'll stay with him every night. I'll pull him out every time. Child! Isolde's grip tightened, and her voice went very gentle, which was somehow the worst thing of all. There is a bond forming between you and the king. I felt it the moment I walked into this room. You must feel it too. The pull, the warmth when you're near him, the ache when you're not. The Moonvale recognize their own. It is the oldest thing in our kind, and it does not ask our permission. And a bond is a bridge. It runs in both directions. She let the words settle. If the hollow takes him under the blood moon and you are bound to him, she stopped and looked at Neris with terrible kindness. Then it does not only take him, little one. It takes you with him. The arrangement, as the king insisted on calling it, settled into a shape over the days that followed, and the shape of it was this. In the daytime, Neris was free. It was the strangest thing, after a lifetime of arithmetic and locked doors, to be handed the run of a palace and told to want for nothing. She didn't know what to do with it. She wandered the libraries and got lost twice. She sat with Wasold in the herb room under the North Tower and learned the names of things, because her hands needed to be busy, or her mind would run straight to the number 19 and stay there. She wrote to her father, a rider carrying it south, that she was safe, the debt gone, and none of the rest, because how could she? Dear Papa, the necklace turned out to be important after all. Also, I may be dying under the next blood moon. The tea here is terrible. She burned 3 drafts and sent a 4th that said only that she loved him. And in the evenings, when the palace quieted and the corridors emptied, a guard walked her up to the iron-banded doors, and she sat with the king while he tried to sleep. At first it was awful. He barely spoke. He'd nod to her when she came in and gesture at the chair, and then lie down fully clothed and stare at the ceiling, radiating attention so complete she could feel it across the room, and she'd sit with her hands folded and count the minutes until his breathing changed. Some nights it took an hour, some nights it never came at all, and he'd rise gray-faced at dawn and thank her stiffly and send her away, and she'd walk back to the tower, aching with a helplessness she remembered from her father's sickbed. Because that was the trouble with the chair. It was too far. Isolde had warned her. The quieting is strongest with nearness. It always was. In the old days, the Moonvale slept in heaps like wolves for a reason. From the chair, the quieting reached him thin and weak, and he'd surface after an hour, jerking awake with his breath sharp and his hands fisted, back in the fog before she could stop it. So one bad night, near the 4th bell, when he'd woken for the 3rd time with that same hunted look, Neris got up out of the chair without letting herself think about it, and sat down on the very edge of the enormous bed. "You wake up less," she said. "When I'm closer. I've been watching. I don't know why, and I don't much care. Give me your hand and go to sleep, Your Majesty, before you fall over dead and take me with you." He looked at her for a long moment in the low firelight. Then, wordless, he put his hand in hers. The pendant went warm, properly warm, a slow spreading heat, like sunlight, and, within minutes, his breathing deepened, and his grip went slack and he was gone, deep and quiet, and this time he stayed. Neris sat on the edge of his bed, holding the hand of the most dangerous man in the kingdom, and thought that not so long ago she'd been worried about running out of coal. It got easier after that. It got, though she'd never have admitted it aloud. Almost good, because a strange thing happens when you sit with someone in the dark, night after night. The walls come down. Not all at once. His came down like a fortress being disassembled one stone at a time, grudging and slow, but they came down. It started with her talking, because she couldn't bear the silence and never could. She told him about the dye house, about the time she'd knocked a whole vat of madder red into the river and turned it pink for a mile downstream, and half the district had blamed a witch. She told him about her father, about Little Moon, about the bitter northern tea he drank that she'd never found anywhere else. She told him stories the way she'd tell them to fill a room, not expecting him to listen. But he listened. She knew, because a week in, over the tea, a servant brought each night. He set down his cup and said, in his low, rough voice, "You never finished The Apprentice, the one you knocked into the dye vat last spring. Did his hair grow back the right color? Neris nearly dropped her cup. You were awake for that? That was 4 nights ago. You'd moved on to the flood before I could ask a pause. And then, she would remember it for a long time. The corner of his hard mouth moved, just slightly, just once. You talk a great deal. I've been told. She lifted her chin. You could always ask me to stop. No, he said, and the humor went out of it and left something quieter and more careful underneath. Don't stop. She noticed the small things after that, once she'd started noticing it all. That the fire was always built up, before she arrived now, never banked. And one night, a small, clay jar, unlabeled, that when she opened it turned out to hold a coarse, dark tea that smelled of pine and bitterness, and her whole childhood, the northern tea her father drank. Where did you get this? She whispered. The king was already looking very intently at the ceiling. I have no idea what you mean, he said, and even in the firelight, she could see the tips of his ears had gone red, and Neris had to press her lips together hard to keep from smiling. And something in her chest that had been braced tight since the night they took her from home eased, just a little, for the first time. That was the night she made the mistake of getting comfortable. That was the night she let herself forget, for a few warm hours, exactly how much there was to be afraid of. She was holding his hand, and he'd been asleep. A while deep and even, and she'd been half drowsing herself, upright on the edge of the bed. And in his sleep, slow and unconscious and certain, the king turned toward her, and drew her hand up against his chest, and held it there, over his heart, the way a man holds the one thing he means to keep, and murmured a single word into the dark that she was fairly sure he didn't know he'd said. Stay. Neris sat very still, her hand rising and falling with his breath, her heart doing something complicated and enormous in her chest, and understood with a cold, clear certainty that she was in a great deal more trouble than any debt had ever put her in. A week later she woke in the Alpha King's arms, and for a few blissful, half-conscious seconds, it was the finest thing that had ever happened to her. She didn't remember lying down. She remembered holding his hand at the fourth bell. She remembered the fire burning low. And now here she was in the gray dawn, with her back against the warm solid length of him, his arm heavy over her waist, his breath stirring her hair, and every part of her fitting against every part of him, like the two of them had been cut from the same piece of something and only now put back together. Then her mind caught up to her body, and the panic arrived all at once. Oh, no. Oh, no, no, no. She tried to slide free, carefully, an inch at a time, and the king's arm tightened around her and drew her back against his chest, and he made a low sound in his sleep and pressed his face into her hair and breathed her in, like a man surfacing from deep water. And under the panic, treacherous and undeniable, was the pull, the one we sold had named, deep and aching and low in her chest, the sense that even every inch of him pressed against her was somehow not close enough and never would be. And something else, something new, underneath her own frightened heartbeat, quiet but unmistakable, something in her stirred. A second presence, ancient and half asleep, uncurling for the first time behind her ribs, lifting its head at the nearness of him. I don't have a wolf, Neris thought, going cold all over despite the warmth of him. I've never had a wolf. Foundlings from the river district. Don't. The king woke. She felt it happen, the change in his breathing. The instant his body understood the position they were in, he went rigid. For one endless moment, neither of them breathed. And then, instead of pulling away, he did the last thing she expected. He drew her closer, still, buried his face against the curve of her neck and inhaled slow and deep and helpless, and a groan rolled low through his chest that she felt more than heard. Then he was gone. He pulled back so fast, the cold rushed in where he'd been, was off the bed and across the room in 3 strides, and the door to his dressing chamber shut behind him hard enough to rattle the weapons on the wall. Neris lay in the tangle of his sheets with her heart trying to climb out of her chest, and stared at the ceiling and thought, that was not nothing. whatever that was for both of us. It was not nothing. She asked Wald that afternoon, the direct way, because she'd run clean out of patience for being managed. Can a foundling have a wolf she never knew about? Can it just wake up after 20 years of nothing? The old woman set down her pestle very slowly. Where, she said, is this coming from? Something moved in me when I was close to him, something that's never moved before. Nerys pressed a hand flat to her own breastbone. I've never shifted, wheesled. Not once. Not as a child, not ever. I always thought I was just human, riverborn, nothing. She swallowed. Am I not? Weisel looked at her for a long time, and there was something in the old face that looked almost like grief and almost like hope. The Moonvale blood is the oldest and the strongest and the most easily hidden of all of us, she said carefully. A young wolf, frightened, alone, wearing a token that quiets, it can sleep, for years, for a whole childhood, if it must, if staying hidden is the only way to stay alive. She reached out and touched the pendant at Nerys's throat with one finger. This didn't only keep you found, child. I think it kept you safe. I think it kept you quiet, and I think being near your own kind, near a bond meant for you, is waking up something that's been waiting your whole life to wake. Her hand dropped. The question you should be asking is not whether you have a wolf. It's why someone went to such trouble 20 years ago to make sure you'd never know you did. Nerys had no answer to that. It followed her, cold and unshakable, all the way back to the king's chambers that night. She should have known better than to sleep herself. But the days were long now, with fear, and the nights were warm. And somewhere near the third bell, holding his hand, she slipped under and woke standing in the fog. She knew it at once, this time the colorless press of it, the dead trees, the cold that burned, the pendant a coin of ice against her chest. But it was deeper now, or she was deeper in it, and through the thinning gray ahead she could see something she hadn't seen before. A great, still expanse, flat and black and smooth as poured glass, stretching away into the fog. Water. And in the water, moving, struggling wolves. Dozens of them. Scores. Sinking into the black glass one by one, their movements slowing, their heads going under, and no sound at all, which was the worst of it. And on the near shore, on his knees, watching them drown, and unable to look away, was the king. Sorin, his name came out of her before. She knew she'd reached for it. She ran to him, drops down beside him in the wrong soft ground. Sorin, look at me. We have to go. His eyes were fixed on the water, on the wolves. His lips were moving, and she leaned close, and heard him saying it over and over, low and broken, like a man who had said it 10,000 times and would say it 10,000 more. I couldn't stop it. I couldn't reach them in time. I couldn't stop it. And then, out on the black water, one of the drowning wolves shifted, the terrible slow wrench of beast into human, and a hand broke the surface and reached toward the shore, toward the king, and a voice came across the water, distorted and desperate and unmistakably real. Please, it said, please, you swore. Nerys's eyes filled with tears. She didn't understand. But her gaze had snagged on something else, something at the edge of the black shore, where the fog moved, where the shapes of the ones who had done this stood watching in the gray. Just an impression, just a color. But she knew that color. She had learned to fear it her whole life, on the livery of the men who'd come to her father's door. Gray and silver. That's not right, some clear cold part of her thought, even as the horror rose. The king ended the war. Everyone says the valleys burned as a casualty of his war. So why are the ones standing over the dead wearing? She never finished the thought. Because the thing in the fog, the patient thing, the one that walked, had finally noticed her. She felt it turn its attention on her like a cold hand closing over the back of her neck, felt it recognize the moon at her throat, felt it want her the way it had wanted him for 20 years. The soft ground surged up around her bare ankles, gripping, dragging, pulling her down toward the black water, and this time when she reached for the king's hand to pull them both out, she felt something else pull back, something vast and hungry and glad. And, for one heart-stopping instant, she understood that it was not going to let her go. She woke screaming. She was upright in the king's bed, drenched in cold sweat, her ankles aching where the ground had gripped them, and the king was awake beside her, awake and bolt upright and staring at her with a look of such total dawning horror that it frightened her more than the fog had. "You were there," he said. His voice was barely a sound at all. "You were there. In the water it had you." His hands came up to grip her shoulders, and they were shaking. "Nerys, tell me the truth. How many times have you followed me into that place?" And she opened her mouth to answer, and saw, over his shoulder, through the window, the moon hanging low and full and beginning, at its very edge, to bruise the faintest shade of red. "Answer me," the king said. His hands were still on her shoulders, still shaking. "How many times?" "3." Her voice was hoarse from screaming. "Maybe 4. I don't always remember." "The first night. And, Soren, it doesn't matter. I can pull you out. I've done it It matters." He let go of her and stood, and she watched him back away from the bed as though she'd become something dangerous. "It matters more than anything, because that place is not a dream, Nerys, and the thing in it is not asleep, and tonight it reached for you. I felt it. I felt it decide it wanted you." His voice cracked down the middle. "It has been trying to take me for 20 years. It has never once in all that time wanted anyone else. And now it's found you, and there is a blood moon rising, and I will not." He stopped, dragged in a breath. When he spoke again, his voice had gone flat and final and terrible. "You're not coming back to this room. Not tonight. Not ever." The floor dropped out from under her. "You don't mean that." "I do." Waisolde said, "The bond is the only thing keeping the hollow off you, that we're stronger together, that if Waisolde is wrong." He wouldn't look at her now. He'd turned to the window, to the reddening edge of the moon, and every line of him had gone rigid. "The bond isn't protecting you. The bond is the road. It's how the thing found you. Every night you sit here and hold my hand, you're building the bridge it's going to use to drag you under with me. And I would rather," his jaw worked, "I would rather never sleep another night in my life than watch that place take you the way it—" He didn't finish. He didn't have to. "So that's it," Nerys said. She was standing now, though she didn't remember rising, and her whole body was shaking with something that wasn't only fear. "You'd rather die alone within the week than let me help you, because that's what you're choosing. You understand that? You're choosing to drown so I don't get wet. Yes." He turned and looked at her then, and his gray eyes were wrecked, and it was almost worse than the coldness. "That is exactly what I'm choosing. Guards will see you to the tower. Don't come back. That's an order, and it's the last one I'll ever give you. And I need you to hate me enough to obey it." His voice dropped to almost nothing. "Please, just this once, hate me and go." She went. There was nothing else to do with a man determined to martyr himself. She walked out past the guards with her chin up and her eyes burning, and the iron-banded doors shut behind her, and in the cold corridor she slid down the black stone wall and finally, let herself cry. She didn't sleep that night, or the next, or the one after that. She'd expected the grief. She hadn't expected the pain, a physical thing. A hollow ache, low in her chest, that grew worse with every hour she spent away from him, as though someone had run a thread through her breastbone and was drawing it slowly, endlessly tight. By the 3rd day, she couldn't eat. By the 4th, she couldn't stand too fast, without the room going gray. Waisolde took one look at her and pressed her lips into a hard, white line. "A forming bond denied," the old woman said grimly, spooning something bitter between Nerys's teeth. "It doesn't break clean, child. It tears. He'll be feeling it too, the fool, whether he admits it or not. She sat back. You have to understand. He's not being cruel. 20 years ago, he swore an oath to protect a people, and he watched them die anyway, and he has spent every night since paying for it. He would sooner cut off his own arm than let it happen to one more soul he cares for, especially you. A pause. Particularly you. Then help me understand it. Nerys pushed the bowl away and made herself sit up, because lying down and dying of heartbreak was not, in the end, in her nature. The hollow. What I saw in it. There were. Why? What I saw in it. The ones who killed the moon veil, and they were wearing gray and silver. The old woman went absolutely still. That's the wrong color, isn't it? Nerys pressed. Everyone says the valleys fell to border raiders. During the war. Casualties of the king's campaign. But raiders don't wear livery. Gray and silver is a house. Her heart was pounding. It's the house that sent men to my father's door. The house that held our debt. Whose colors are those, Wizold? Say it. Wizold's voice, when it came, was barely a whisper. House Varric. The name landed in the room like a dropped stone. Lord Varric held the border commission the year the Moonville died. The old woman went on, slowly, as though the words were being pulled out of her against her will. And, when they were gone, and their valleys empty, it was House Varric that was granted the land, for services in the war. Her old eyes came up, and they were frightened, in a way that frightened Nerys more than anything yet. I never let myself think it, none of us did. It was easier to believe our king had blood on his hands than to believe a lord of the realm had. The door opened without a knock. Nerys turned, expecting a servant, expecting Tallis, and found instead a tall man in immaculate gray and silver standing in the doorway of the herb room. A man she had never met, and recognized instantly, because she had spent her whole life afraid of his colors. Lord Varric was silver-haired and pleasant-faced, and his smile was the smile of a man who has never once in his life failed to get what he wanted. Forgive the intrusion, he said smoothly. I heard the palace had taken in a River District girl over some trifling debt of mine, and I confess my curiosity got the better of me. One does like to see what one's owed. His gaze drifted, idle and warm, down to her throat, and stopped. And Nerys watched the pleasant face change, watched 20 years of certainty crack down the middle, watched the exact moment Lord Varric recognized the small silver moon he had believed he'd burned out of the world. His smile didn't waver. That was the terrible part. It widened well, he said softly, delighted. Aren't you a long way from dead? They moved her that night, on Tallis's order, to a windowless inner room with 2 guards at the door. Tallis, whose sharp eyes had gone sharper still when Isolde told him what she'd pieced together, who'd said only, I've suspected the shape of it for years. I've never had the missing piece, and had looked at the moon around Nerys's neck like a man looking at a loaded weapon. Now I do. But Varric has friends, and proof takes time, and time is the one thing we don't. The blood moon is tomorrow, Nerys said. I know, she was fading, and she knew that too. The bondache had become a constant roar, and with it, worse, a bleeding away of something she couldn't name, as though somewhere across the palace a lamp was guttering, and she was the wick. Twice that night she caught herself sliding sideways out of her own body toward the gray, and hauled herself back only by pressing the pendant so hard against her palm it left a mark. Near the 4th bell, the door opened, and it was him. He looked worse than she did. 6 days without sleep, without her. And the War King who'd ended a war through sheer unbearable presence could barely hold himself upright in the doorframe. But his eyes, when they found her, were burning. I couldn't stay away, Soren said. He said it like a confession, like a defeat. I told myself I was protecting you. And then Tallis told me Varric had seen you, that he knows you're alive. And I understood that keeping my distance never protected you at all. It only left you alone. He crossed the room and dropped to his knees beside her cot, which no king should ever do, and took her face in his shaking hands. I have spent 20 years paying a debt with the only currency I had, which was myself. I thought if I gave enough of me, it might be enough. And then you walked into my throne room wearing a dead child's moon, and for the first time in 20 years I wanted to live long enough to see the next morning. And I was so afraid of losing that, I threw it away with my own hands. His thumb moved across her cheek. Forgive me. Please. I don't know how to do this. I've never wanted anything I was allowed to keep. Neris, who had spent her whole life being small and quiet and surviving, reached up and took hold of his wrists. Then keep me, she said. I'm not a debt, Soren. I'm not a payment, or a penance, or one more thing you have to be strong enough to lose. I'm just yours, if you'll have me. The kiss, when it came, was years in the making. 20 years of held breath went into it, and 6 days of tearing ache, and something older than both of them that had recognized its match across a cold throne room and refused, ever since, to be talked out of it. And the pendant between them flared warm, and then warmer, gold spilling through her whole chest, and the ancient sleeping thing behind her ribs came fully, joyfully awake at last, her wolf, her true and hidden self, rising to meet him. And then the bond sealed, the last thread drawing tight and locking home, the two of them becoming, in the way of the oldest blood, a single unbroken thing. She felt it settle into her chest, warm and golden and right, and something in the king, that had been clenched tight for 20 years, finally let go. He held her for a long while after, his forehead against hers, neither of them saying anything, because there was nothing that needed saying. And then, still holding her hand, he slept. He slept the way she'd only seen him sleep, with his hand in hers, deep and even and utterly at peace, one arm locked around her waist, as though even unconscious he'd finally decided to stop letting go of things. Neris lay in the circle of him, in the dark, and felt his heart beat against her spine, slow and sure, and let herself, for the first time since the collectors came to her father's door, believe that the future might be a thing she got to have. We'll face Varric in the morning, she thought drowsily, the golden warmth of the bond humming through her. Talus will find his proof, the blood moon will pass, Soren will sleep, and I'll help him, and we'll be all right. It's going to be all right. She closed her eyes and let the warmth carry her under. She woke, standing in the fog, and the blood moon had already risen. The hollow had never looked like this. The gray had gone, the deep bruised red of the moon overhead, and the cold was a living thing now, and the black water had swelled into a vast heaving lake that lapped at her bare feet, and the pull of it dragged at her from every direction at once. And far out across the red water, so far she could barely see him, being drawn down into the dark faster than she could ever hope to reach, was Soren. The sealed bond, the warm, golden thread that had felt like salvation an hour ago, drew taut between them, and Neris understood. Too late, exactly what Soren had tried to warn her of. The bond was a bridge. And the thing in the hollow was crossing it, and using it to pull them both under together. Soren, her voice tore across the red water, and this time, because the bond was sealed, because they were one thing now. This time he heard it. His head came up. Their eyes met across the terrible distance. And for one instant she saw hope flare in his face. And then she saw him understand what his hope had cost her. Saw him realize she was here, that she'd been pulled in with him. And the hope curdled into a horror worse than any despair. No, he said. No, you have to wake up. You have to. But the water had her ankles now, and the ground had gone soft and hungry beneath her, and there was no waking, not tonight, not under this moon. So, Neris stopped trying to flee it, and did the only thing she had ever truly known how to do. She put her head down and she fought toward him, one dragging step at a time, through water that pulled like grief, and cold that burned like guilt, until at last she reached the place where he knelt sinking on the drowned red shore and dropped down beside him and took his face in her hands. And that was when the woman came out of the fog. She walked across the surface of the black water without sinking, and she was beautiful and terrible and dead, sorrow etched into every line of her and eyes, the color of the moon, and when Soren saw her, he made a sound Nerys had never heard a human being make. "No," he whispered. "Not you, please. Not you again. You swore." The woman's voice was soft and patient and endlessly kind, which was the most horrible thing about it. "You swore an oath to my people, Alpha. You swore we would be safe under your banner. And where were you when the fires came? Where were you when they cut us down in our valleys? With your war for cover." She drifted closer. "Every soul. And the last of my line, the babe I put into hands, I trusted to carry her to safety, dead in a ditch, before her first winter, because a king was too far away, and too slow, and too proud. This blood is on your hands. It has always been on your hands, and you have always, always known it." "Yes," Soren breathed, and his head dropped. And Nerys felt through the bond the vast black tide of his agreement, felt him begin to let the water take him, because he believed every word. "Yes, I know, I'm sorry. I'm sorry." "Let it be finished. Let me pay it." "Soren?" "No." But Nerys's gaze had caught, as it had caught once before, on the shapes standing in the red fog behind the woman, on the ones who had done this, on the gray. And the last piece dropped into place with a clarity that cut through the pull of the water like a blade. "Soren, look at them. Look. The ones who killed them? They're not your soldiers. They never were. That's House Varric. Varric did this. He drew your forces to the far border with a false alarm. He destroyed the Moonvale, while your war gave him cover, and he took their land and let the whole realm believe it was your doing. You didn't fail to protect them, Soren. You were betrayed." Soren's head came up, something flickered in the drowned ruin of his face, and then guttered out. "It doesn't matter," he said dully, "whose blade it was. I swore I wasn't there. The child died because I wasn't there. Knowing the name of the man who lit the fire doesn't bring one soul of them back." He looked at the dead woman, and his voice broke entirely. "It doesn't bring her back." And the woman smiled, because that was the truth. The whole hollow was built on, not the facts but his need to keep paying, and she reached out one dead hand to draw him down into the dark for the last time, but Nerys was already moving. Because she had finally seen the woman's face. Truly, seen it. The line of the jaw, the set of the mouth, the moon-colored eyes, she had seen that face before, every morning of her life, looking back at her out of still water and polished silver. And the pendant against her chest had gone from cold to blazing, blazing warm, pouring light, and behind her ribs her wolf rose up howling. 20 years of sleep burning off her all at once, and Nerys stepped between the dead woman and the drowning king, and stood and blazed, and said the truest thing she had ever said. The child didn't die. The woman went still. The whole red hollow went still. "The child didn't die," Nerys said again, and her voice rang out across the water, and it was steady now because she finally understood who she was. "You put her into hands you trusted, and those hands carried her south, all the way to a dye house in the river district, and left her on the coldest night of a bad year with a moon around her neck. And a tired, poor, kind man opened his door and found her and could not give her up. He called her little moon. He kept the pendant on her. Because you begged him to. He raised her and fed her when there wasn't enough, and put himself between her and armed men when the debt came due. Because that child lived, and she is standing here, and she is looking at your face, and it is the same as her own." Tears were pouring down her cheeks, and she let them. "Hello, mother." The dead woman's terrible kindness cracked. And underneath it, for just a moment, something else looked out. Something that was not the hollow's lie at all, but the last true fragment of a woman who had died with a single desperate hope, and now impossibly saw it fulfilled. Nerys turned to Soren, knelt, took his face in her blazing hands. "She didn't hand you a failure to carry for 20 years," she said. "She handed you a child to save. And you saved her. Soren, not with a sword, not that night, but the pendant that quieted her, and hid her, and kept her alive all these years, the one that led her back to a throne room, to a king who'd stop breathing at the sight of it. That was your oath, keeping her. All this time, the debt is paid. Do you hear me? It was paid the night I lived." Her voice dropped, and now she was not only speaking to him, she was speaking to the frightened foundling she had been her whole life, the one who'd believed she was something to be given away, disposable, owed. "We've both spent our whole lives paying a debt that was never ours. I thought I was thrown away. You thought you were guilty. Neither of us was. We were only ever saved, and hidden, and loved." She pressed her forehead to his. "Put it down, Soren. Please, you're allowed. Put it down and come home with me. For one long suspended moment. Nothing." Then Soren's hand rose and closed around hers, and he turned to the dead woman, to the drowning host behind her, to all the lost souls of the Moonvale, and he wept, and he said, "I'm sorry. I couldn't reach you in time, and I have hated myself for it every night for 20 years, and I would give anything to have come sooner, but I did keep her. I kept your daughter, and I'm going to keep her still." He drew a shaking breath. "Rest now. It's finished. Let me lay it down." The blood moon overhead began slowly to pale. The dead woman looked at her daughter one last time, and the last true fragment of her smiled, whole and free, and closed her moon-colored eyes, and dissolved into the thinning fog-like breath in cold air. And behind her, one by one, the lost host of the Moonvale turned and followed her into the gray, their long grief unwinding, their voices fading into something almost like peace. The black water sank. The red light died to gray, and then to gold, and then to the ordinary dark of a bedchamber before dawn. Soren fell forward into her arms, and she caught him and held him. 20 years of grief pouring out of him at last, and she pressed her lips to his hair and whispered over and over, "I've got you, I've got you, I'm here, I lived, I've got you." They woke in each other's arms in the gray light of morning. In the waking world, the blood moon set at last, and its long threat gone with it. And for the first time in 20 years, the Alpha King of Iron Moon had slept the whole night through and dreamed of nothing at all. Varric's reckoning came 3 days later, though Nerys was only told of it afterward. Talus, it turned out, had spent years quietly gathering what threads he could, and the missing piece had walked into the palace on a chain around a river girl's neck. Faced with the surviving Moonvale heir, with old accounts of land granted and men deployed, with a beta who had waited a very long time, and a king with nothing left to be afraid of, Lord Varric discovered at last that there was one debt in the realm he could not buy, sell, or escape. He did not enjoy the discovering. The nightmares didn't stop all at once. Healing, Nerys was learning, never worked the way the stories promised. No single golden moment that fixed a broken thing forever. Some nights Soren still woke in the dark, with his breath sharp and his hands fisted back on a cold red shore, for a few terrible seconds before he remembered where he was, but he was never alone in it now. She was there every time, warm and stubborn beside him, and she'd take his hand and say his name until the fog let go, and slowly, over weeks, over months, the bad nights grew rarer, and the peaceful ones grew long. The court took rather longer to recover than the king did. A foundling dyer's daughter from the river district, turning out to be the lost heir of an ancient vanished pack, and the maid of the Alpha King besides, was a great deal of story for one season, and the whispers followed Nerys for a good long while. She minded them less than she'd expected. It's difficult to be wounded by a whisper, when you've walked into the country of the dead, and back out again, holding the hand of the man you love. They wed under a white moon in the high valleys of the Moonvale. On land returned at last to its rightful line, and her father came north for the wedding, recovered, grayer, weeping openly through the whole of it. And when Soren knelt to thank the tired, poor kind man who had opened his door on a cold night, around its neck, Edmund Thorne only gripped the king's hands and said, "She looked at me, that's all. She looked at me, and I was hers." And Nerys, standing between the two men who had each in their own way kept her alive, understood that she had never been a debt to a single soul who mattered. Now, months later, she woke slowly to pale morning light through the curtains of the room they shared. Soren was still asleep beside her, deeply, easily, one arm wrapped around her waist, even in sleep, his face smooth and untroubled, no fog waiting anywhere behind his eyes to pull him under. The pendant lay warm against her breastbone, quiet and content, its long work finally done. She thought of a cold marble floor, and 100 frightened heartbeats of a girl who'd knelt as a payment and prayed only to be sent somewhere with a door and a bucket and nobody who cared what her name was. Everybody knew her name now. And the most dangerous man alive was sleeping soundly at her side. The same man a whole frozen court had once watched come down off his throne and go silent at the sight of a moon around a debtor's neck, too astonished to breathe. She smiled and settled back against him and let her eyes drift closed. And the two of them slept, safe and bound and free of every debt at last.